Hello, it's me again. I wanted to talk today about uh, issues I have with miscommunication between people. And this is something that I do with most everyone in some way or another, but I've managed to keep a hold of it for most of my adult life. Although, as a kid, I think perhaps either I overlooked it or I had mistook it for other things in my life. The kind of stress that you get whenever you talk with somebody. And I tend to have a very overactive imagination. So sometimes if I react strongly towards someone due to something that they said or something that I misunderstood, they might claim that I am oversensitive. Which, yes, is true. That is true. But saying so never helps the problem. You know, I'm the kind of person that kind of requires validation quite a bit. And I don't like to put that on people if I can help it. But I need ultimate clarity in a conversation, or else I'll get confused or upset. And that will take some time for me to work on, understanding my own emotions in the first place. Because sometimes I don't exactly understand why I feel the way I do until I kind of talk it out with someone. And so, like yesterday, I had kind of I don't know if I'd characterize it as an argument necessarily, but it was kind of a tense conversation in which I was texting my friend, and he was at work, and we had brought up some slightly personal topics, or he did, and we were talking about different people in his life. And then once it got to a personal, I guess too personal of a level, he said, "This conversation's a little too feely for work right now." Or maybe I don't know if he said right now, but at the time, I know that he meant right now. But at the time when I read that, I interpreted it as ever. Um, and that frustrated me because I thought he was trying to put a complete restriction on the conversation as far as what kind of topics we could discuss. But if he had said, "I'm sorry, I need to focus," then I would have just left it alone completely. It wouldn't have created an issue in my mind. Because I do my best to consider what other people are going through, but it can be hard when you're talking to someone at a distance and you desire to have a close connection with that person and to talk to them about their feelings and their desires and their hopes and things of that nature. And you say certain things to them that, I don't know, trigger some sort of response that maybe from their point of view isn't aggressive or argumentative in any way, but in my head I sometimes interpret it that way. So sometimes it's an issue with my interpretation of the conversation, especially over text. It's super hard to do. It's almost impossible to relate to someone's emotions when you're only texting. And so that's where a lot of my communication issues come from. But I also have it in verbal communication as well. Another friend of mine, when I had gone to visit him a few times, I had done things such as offer to cook. But there are certain aspects of that I didn't necessarily volunteer to do, and I felt very isolated and lonely in his presence because of what happened. Um, like things like, of course I will clean up after myself of the messes that I make, but I wanted to have his help as well, because I was in his house touching his things, and I didn't want to feel obligated to do all of this for him. Like I really wanted to like show him my cooking. That was the whole crux of the issue. I just wanted to share something with him. But it got to a point where I was getting frustrated that I was doing all these things for him while each of us were trying to balance our own work lives at the same time, because I was working remotely and I took my laptop over there with me to work while he was at work. And so I would try to plan it out that I wouldn't necessarily have to work all the time, or when he was around and we were able to spend time together. Um, but I kept doing all these things, and cooking and cleaning up, and it was exhausting. It was so exhausting because I was having to go through an entire workday and cook and clean for myself as well as for him, and I didn't feel at the time that I was getting any help with that, and so that was frustrating. And we did have a conversation about it eventually. I still don't entirely know what that was from his perspective. And there was a time, like, he said something that kind of triggered an emotional response from me, which isn't his fault necessarily. I own up to my own feelings about a situation, but I felt like we needed to discuss that. It never really got fully discussed completely because I don't know. It's hard to get in his head sometimes. It's hard to get him to open up. He doesn't open up very much. But what he had said basically is I he noticed I was using a lot of his paper towels. And he made a comment like, "Am I going to have to buy some more paper towels since you're using so much?" or something to that effect. And that made me feel offended and underappreciated because, first of all, his apartment had few supplies in the first place, and I needed to use those paper towels to kind of dry things off because he had cloth towels as well, but those got quickly saturated and quickly unusable because they got too wet. So sometimes I'd have to use the paper towels to make sure everything was the way it needed to be, because I do have a fairly particular way of cleaning things, and especially dishes, things you eat off of. I want to make sure that shit's spotless. And so I needed the room too. The amount of room that I had was so limited that I had like less than half of what a normal kitchen would be like. So I just, because of all of that compounding on top of one another and all those feelings, I blew up at him. I said, I don't quite even remember what I said, but I think I just said something like, "Fine, I'll just fucking buy it whenever I can. You don't have to worry about this shit." I had some sort of angry outburst like that to him because I was so frustrated, and I felt, I felt like Cinderella, uh, doing all these things for someone and not being appreciated. That's how I felt. And he assured me later that he does appreciate what I do for him, but I don't think he always knows how to show it. And when I tried to discuss it, um, had to leave the room because he wasn't communicating with me. He's the type of person that if you yell at him, he kind of shuts down. That's kind of a coping mechanism that some people have. And I tried to sit down calmly next to him and discuss it. And I was saying a few things, and I said, "I'm sorry I blew up at you. I've just been frustrated. I didn't feel like you had appreciated what I was doing at the time." And he was looking at his phone, not looking at me directly. And that frustrated me even more. And so I just said to myself, fine, I'll let this go. And I left the room. I left the room for probably 30 minutes, 40 minutes or so. I don't know how long it was. It was a while because I needed to blow off steam and I didn't want to blow up at him even more because I felt like I was on the verge of really screaming at him. Because of all these chaotic feelings that I had in my head. So sometimes I just have to separate myself from the situation and think about it, or distract myself with something, walk around, which is pretty much what I did. And then I went back in there and, he was playing a game in there and doing his normal thing. And I think we were just trying to keep the peace the best we could and not make things so tense. But when people don't communicate with me clearly, or they make remarks that don't show a complete understanding from my perspective, it frustrates me and it makes me angry. And that's something I'm trying to get under wraps. I'm soon finally going to be visiting a therapist very soon. But even so, I think in that situation, it should have been something that we could have discussed. Even though probably both of us were feeling kind of like nerve shot almost, I guess. I mean, we did get to the discussion eventually, but I would have preferred if it had happened right there and then, because my emotions did not calm and I cried about it silently that night. There were nights like that I just kind of cried alone, and because I felt like I wasn't being heard and I couldn't express my feelings truly. I felt like I wasn't allowed to do that. I felt like, and that just contributed even more to my loneliness and the further miscommunication and the, um, complete distance from having a more intimate relationship, perhaps. Because if we had come to understand each other much earlier, or had compromises with one another, maybe our the romantic aspect of our relationship that we used to have would have survived perhaps longer, or we could have come up with some sort of compromise in some way. That's my goal, is to start to compromise more, but also let my feelings be heard in a calm and respectful manner. So I think that's something that I need to work on with a lot of my friends, because I don't always feel understood or appreciated. But I also have to remind myself that everyone has their own lives and they have their own way of interpreting reality. And it's not always in line with what I have in my head. So I have to be a little bit more introspective about that. And that's a struggle of mine. But thank you very much for listening. Find love and light in your life.